distinction of always presenting on a day where it rains or snows.
Yes.
So thank you for coming today.
Timing.
Excellent. So I'm Adrienne, and I'm going to talk about my presentation today, which I think the question, am I up for this, really captures the students' experience in my class in many ways, and so I'll be talking about that. So first, just to talk a little bit about my dissertation. This is, the stuff I'm talking about today is stuff that I haven't spent as much time on yet, but I've been waiting to find the right moment to go back to this part of, or this story as it emerged in that research, and so I'm going to present it in that light. So in fall 2012, I conducted a teacher research study of my English 1020 class, and I wanted to especially learn how inquiry-based and reflective teaching and learning strategies impacted students' near transfer of writing-related knowledge, particularly what they took from one project that helped them build toward their work and their rhetorical decision-making in the next project. So I wasn't looking at knowledge transfer longitudinally or anything, but in very close quarters. Essentially, I wanted to understand how they used question asking and reflection to make their rhetorical decisions, and whether the conditions for learning that I employed in the classroom fostered that learning. And so to help them practice that, I created a project sequence that moved students from practicing asking questions and researching in an iSearch paper into crafting researched arguments and designing artifacts in various genres that could support that work. And we did a lot of in-class brainstorming, small group collaborative writing, written reflection, and writing on blogs, which we used as a way to share ideas with each other and also to practice just playing with the kinds of things we were working on. Throughout this semester, I took field notes on my class sessions. I would jot down notes in class and then type up more complete notes when I returned to my office. I audio taped several class sessions and collected all of the student writing for analysis. 15 of the 24 students in the class participated in my study, and all but three of them were first semester freshmen. David, the student that I'm going to talk about today, appears in several footnotes of my dissertation. He was the oldest student in class. He was in his 60s, a tall African-American man who was returning to school after working for the auto industry. Some of what I'll present today about David's experience in the class comes from the text of that dissertation, but I'm also thinking about trying to connect those threads, trying to understand what I can learn now from looking back 5 years later on that material. So there are a lot of moments in the footnotes that say, you know, a future study on X, Y, or Z could be interesting to look at with David, and but now's the time, I guess, for me to do that. So thus far, I've developed conclusions about the whole study, namely about the impact of directive teacher feedback in progressively oriented composition classes, and about the ways that students orient themselves as learners in relationship to peers and their teacher. I finished that project understanding that I had a lot more to learn from him, and I wanted to think about how he moved through the class, thinking about how a non-traditional student encounters moments and recontextualizes prior knowledge in the writing class. So today I present the beginnings of that. To think about David's experience now, I want to briefly consider a few pieces of scholarship. First, Marilyn Cooper's 2011 article, Rhetorical Agency, Emergent and Enacted, which was influential in my attention to the ways that students used reflection to identify both the ways that they drew from others to craft their writing and how they understood the impact of their rhetorical action on others in the classroom specifically. Then Yancey Robertson and Tazak's 2014 book, Writing Across Contexts, Transfer Composition and Sites of Writing, which provides some vocabulary for the process of students transitioning from one writing experience to the next, and Navari Cleary's 2013, Flowing and Freestyling, Learning from Adult Students about Process Knowledge Transfer, that explores some of those moments of transition as experienced by adult learners, not in a writing class, but in a Foundations of Adult Learning class. And finally, in a text that's influential to my construction of how I teach my classroom, Brian Camborne's Toward an Educationally Relevant Theory of Literacy Learning, where he describes 7 conditions of learning and their related concepts. And of special importance today is the concept of setting expectations for learners, which are set for learners by teachers or trusted others who support their work and learning. So, where do I want to go now? Cooper argues that we embody rhetorical agency, and that as responsible readers, we understand that what we present contributes both to our own ethos and impacts our audience, and that responsible readers are open to being changed by others. They understand that they don't hold all meaning in themselves. Though all rhetorical action is bound up in this construction and impact, she would say, whether we actively consider this reflexivity, what we give and what we receive, responsible readers move beyond the sort of unconscious aspects of that to acknowledge the agency of their audience and engage in a rhetorical act that is invitational and open to cooperation and change. My first year writing class, both now and in 2012, was constructed on a foundation of cooperative and collaborative research and writing, and I saw that the understanding of networked learning, of one's own development of content knowledge and rhetorical skills as bound up in a series of interactions and critical incidents with texts and other learners was integral for students' preparation for college-level research and writing. That term, critical incidents, comes from Yancey, Robertson, and Tazak. They build this vocabulary of knowledge transfer, and they offer three terms, assemblage, remixing, and critical incidents, to talk about the different ways that students deal with prior knowledge to build new knowledge. Remixing or recontextualizing, that's the term that I'm more apt to use, occurs when students negotiate between prior knowledge and the present moment and reconstruct that knowledge for application. Assemblage happens when they apply prior knowledge without recontextualizing it for the new moment, and sort of like adding it on to what they're supposed to do. And critical incidents happen when students apply prior knowledge with little or no positive impact, and then they have to reframe and try again. Varty Cleary's studies of 2 adult learners and process knowledge transfer lead her to argue that learners are more likely to invest in writing when the writing tasks align with their personal goals and their life situations, and they're more likely to internalize input from peers about their writing and other strategies for recontextualizing when they experience that kind of personal investment. And then finally, Camborne's theory, especially with expectations and principles of engagement, says ultimately that learners are capable, they're more likely to engage in what's happening if they believe they're capable, if they see a value or purpose in what they're doing, if they're free from anxiety in the class, and if they're able to see demonstrations by somebody that they like and respect and trust. So, in short, in my class, my demonstrated expectations of a kind of openness to learning, a kind of responsible rhetorical action, mirrored what I think David brought into my class and set the conditions of learning through which he could further develop his writing-related knowledge. But I don't want to talk so much about what I did. I want to just talk for a few minutes about what David did in the class, because it's important, I think, to acknowledge that he brought this disposition with him into the class. Not what I did didn't change him. What David did in the class might be categorized as a series of critical incidents, and I argue that both because of his sense of rhetorical responsibility, as evidenced in his reflections and classroom interactions throughout the semester, and the relationship building between he and I, he was able to persist through these several critical incidents. In his personal introduction, David wrote, "Where you come from establishes your being, and that the past structures the present." My discussions with David often took place while other students were packing up to leave the class. Often we talked about current events, politics, and sports, but we also had several conversations about his revision work and about the dynamics of the group he was working with in the second part of the semester. Several times he commented to me about feeling like he didn't fit in because he was older, and explained to me how he was trying to engage with his group members. David participated in every class discussion, both responding to questions and raising them, but I often had to clarify his questions or responses and state them in ways that others could understand what he was asking, when the connections that he was making were implicit, and I had to bring them out a little bit more. He was significantly older than the other students in the class and unfamiliar with some of the technologies we used. He expressed his concern about his writing ability, and he also wrote about that in a lot of his blogs. So while they're not representative of single moments in time, I just want to label quickly David's experience in the class with 4 critical incidents, and then maybe if we have time to talk, I can talk in more depth about them. These 4 critical incidents in the class were blogging, engaging in research writing and storytelling, whole class dialogue, and actually I'm going to kind of split apart these two on the bottom. The physical classroom and his work with his writing group were very important. So most of what David got out of the class was through his whole class conversation. He wrote in some of his reflections that was where he really saw like the value in the class was being able to bounce ideas off of other people and work through them in that way. But with some of these other things, he had to demonstrate his persistence and do some of that recontextualizing to be able to be successful in the class. So for example, blogging, there's a reflection moment, and I think I have it on this previous slide. Do I have it? Oh, I have never been in an English classroom before where there were so many computers. We were in 335 State Hall, which is basically 4 tables of computers, and I mean that's pretty much the entire room is just computers. And I'll say a few more things about that. But for David, it wasn't just that we were writing in a new genre for him, the blog. It was even just getting to the blog, signing up for a blog, using a computer to write on a regular basis. That was a challenge. One thing that I can say quickly is that he definitely persisted through that. In his final reflection of this semester, I love reading this part. He writes that he conquered blogging, and that he thinks he did. Matter of fact, had done pretty good blogging. I mean, he felt really successful about that. That for him was like the first critical encounter of the class that he had to work through. And I think that wasn't just about. It was maybe more about the technology at the beginning, but it became about something else. In research writing in the class, in our initial project, David drew mostly on storytelling as his form of research, and then over the course of the semester was able to engage in more secondary research and try that out, not just as a part of the class, but I think if I were to talk in more depth about his initial research experience versus his later research experience, his initial one was more reflective. Here's what I think about the topic, whereas later in the semester he learned to actually dig into new information. I mentioned the physical classroom was a bit of a challenge, and I'm kind of just going through this stuff quickly now, but in that it was hard for any of us to work in that classroom and to see each other. We did a lot of collaborative work, but then in David's writing group, and this is where these two things are tied together, there were a lot of social challenges as well. He was the older student, and then all of the other 4 students in his group were first semester freshman women. So we had this one limitation of we can't see each other past the computers, which is kind of the seated challenge in that class. But even when I demonstrated how you could sit at the end of the table and you can all see each other and we can move, it didn't. The social tensions didn't allow. They didn't decide to change, and so there was a lot more in there that was challenging. But I think David conquered that by going outside of his group to find more positive places for his collaboration. So, for example, he was a veteran, and then we had one more veteran student in class, and they talked a lot about that student's topic and what he could contribute there. So I thought that was really useful. Real quickly, in closing this, I'll just so that my peers have some time to talk. I want to read just from a little moment in my field notes. From his reflection. David wrote about his group. I see my group project as a learning experience for me to find my way into the group. I'm the oldest member of my class and the most experienced member of the class. I just try to fit in with the group without being an overburden to the group. I know now that I lost valuable time by bringing up ideas that my group has rejected. I'm not as proficient in communication as my group members, but I bring to the table a wealth of knowledge. My group is the most intelligent in the class, and I'm proud of them. Felicity, the chairperson, has done a fantastic job. I just wish that I could have been more helpful. I feel that the class discussions help out a lot in identifying different writing skills and different patterns of writing in this class. Luke and I are both veterans, and he's writing about veterans here at Wayne State. We had a good discussion about veterans, which helped me see where I could influence him to open up more about himself. So even though David had challenges in his own group, he was able to sort of branch outside of that and see where he was able to contribute to the class. I think that his experience in my class seems to offer an interesting third case study. Navari Cleary talks about 2 students. So like one of them, he sticks close to his prior knowledge as he works through the initial stages of the class, but he doesn't resist learning new things and trying new conventions. He instead is very invested in learning and is very open to learning from other people, which I think that despite the various challenges that that potential roadblocks that David faced, he was able to work through them because of his disposition in the class. And so I just sort of rushed through that stuff a little bit to give us all time to talk about. I have more examples I can talk about later. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you want me to pull it up? Yes, please.
Switch Okay. Thanks, Aid. So I'll be switching our perspective a little bit. So while Adrienne was focusing on a single student, I'm going to be taking a wider stance and look at and talk about 3 sections of English 1020 that I've taught over the past several years. And the title is Bienvenido al Inglés 10-20, which I have learned to say with a little bit of confidence. That's right. I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I have been working with our Chicano Boricua Studies program. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But just a little bit of background if anyone doesn't know as much about this program. The CBS program at Wayne State is a place to provide Latino and Latina students with advising, tutoring, mentoring, and enrollment in CBS-specific courses. So oftentimes CBS students operate within the university in a cohort that's highly supported, not unlike our Apex cohort, with lots of mentoring and administrative help. And there's a lot of interesting features to working with a cohort in my English 1020 class. There's a very tight-knit group that comes to you. They know each other, they've been working together already. They have a lot of shared prior knowledge, and they share a lot of their current contexts. So everybody's taking the same midterm on the same day. Everybody's going through similar academic stresses. However, that's not to say that it's a homogeneous group. The students have diverse academic goals, and they all have diverse, and I would say individual purposes for their writing and their learning about writing. So I'll be talking about all of these courses, all of these sections were with me in the context of the composition learning community, which is a learning community that we have been growing within the composition program. It's for composition students specifically, and it's been interesting to see my CBS cohorts interact with the composition learning community. And so I'll be talking a little bit about what that has meant for them, particularly as an avenue to publish their work and their perceptions about writing. So in the class, the composition learning community supports students not only by connecting them to a broader network of composition courses, so they can realize and see, oh, I'm in this composition class, my friend is in this other composition class, we're all part of this learning community that my teacher keeps telling me about. Also, we have peer mentors in the classroom with the students, and then at the end of each semester we have a writing showcase where we have all of the students put together presentations. Now, the 3 CBS courses that I'm going to be talking to you about, I engaged different pedagogical strategies or teaching strategies to help bridge the struggles or the tensions, we might say, that I was noticing creep up within this unique cohort of students. And the first semester I ever taught a CBS course, we started with reframing the deficit model, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. The second time around, since I was familiar with the community of students that I would be working with, we worked on giving voice to student identities within an academic context. And the third semester, due to cultural and political events, we worked on listening and creating a safe space in the classroom. So first I'll talk about we're reframing the deficit model. And for those of us who may not be familiar with that term, it's an educational term wherein a teacher or administrators or any sort of institutional representative would look at a student in terms of what they don't bring to the table. So Aid was talking a lot about David bringing things to the table. That would be the opposite of a deficit model. You're looking not at what the student doesn't know and what they can't do, but you're looking instead at what they do know and what they can do as a place to start building. So Brannon talks about the deficit understanding, and especially in terms of diversity, that a deficit model would see a CBS cohort, for example, as a lot of weaknesses. These students are not as familiar with the academic culture or may not have the same vocabulary that other students might. So to counter that, I looked at the CBS cohort that I was working with, and I could see even physically, even in their body language, there was a lot of tension and resistance to being in English 1020, which is a first-year composition course. And through talking with some of the students, some of that came to pass because of unfortunate interactions they'd had with their previous English teacher, who, from my understanding, had worked largely from a deficit model with them. So we switched. We turned it on its head, and I used explicit instruction where I engaged them in discussions about the deficit model and named it. Okay, so that's what you experienced. Here's something else that I'd like to work from, which Albert calls the abundance model, where we honor prior knowledge. We say, what do you know? What are your experiences? And this fostered a confidence in the students to ask questions, which sometimes at first seemed pointed and I will just say sassy. So the students, as they began to respond to my explicit telling them, you're a scholar, you're a writer, you're in my class, okay, you have prior knowledge that we're going to work with. The students gained a little boldness to start saying, like, okay, so then why do we do this? Why are we doing this reflection? And instead of responding to those tones in a nipping it in the bud sort of tone, I will say, I, being in the throes of my own dissertation, was said, game on. We'll talk. So we talked about theorists in composition and rhetoric, and wonderfully, since I was reading hundreds of books at the time, I could say, yes, well, that's this theory. And the students, rather than being bored by that, they were, the light bulb went on, because suddenly we were engaging in a scholarly conversation where their questions were not only being entertained, but responded to respectfully, as though they were themselves scholars who needed to have evidence presented to them. And so this, along with the verbal encouragement, I would use explicit terms and give them explicit and specific feedback for these questions, changed the whole feeling of the classroom. Everything from the body language to the quality of their writing changed, because being taken seriously as learners who bring something to the classroom, they began to take the assignment seriously and take my instruction seriously. And so this changed our relationship. It changed the teacher-student relationship. So where it began with distrust and tension and anger, it turned into a collaborative identity where our whole relationship changed, and they took on their own group identity as bilingual scholars. And when that cohort was given the chance to present their work in the Composition Learning Community's writing showcase, they very proudly asked and made their sign for their English 1020 group in Spanish. And so their sign said, and you can kind of see it here, Inglés 1020. And so then they were able to talk through their research projects with non-CBS students who came to their table. And they had taken on this group identity as scholars, that their bilingualism and their identity as CBS students was not a deficit. It was a strength that they could use even in conversation with other scholars. So the second time I taught a CBS course, we worked on giving voice to student identities. This came from, again, as we were talking about honoring prior knowledge and not working from a deficit model, Richie says that there are assumptions that students carry from previous school experiences that clash with expectations for their writing and self in college classes. So, for instance, in my senior year of high school, my teacher told me that I can't write. And then I could get to Nicole Varty's English class and she says, you're a writer. And that's a clash of expectations because I'm expecting students to write with some regularity. So this kind of clash fosters sometimes a disconnect or an oscillation where students get a little paralyzed in their writing. So in order to ameliorate that, some of the pedagogical strategies I used particularly were pointed reflection prompts to help students work through those past experiences and help themselves build a metacognitive bridge from the instances where they had experiences that told them they were not belonging here, they didn't have a voice, to transition, how do you have a voice? What do you want to say with your voice? So that took a lot of reflective writing and also reflective discussion where students could be led through awareness of their current tensions of identity. And so there was pushback here where students talked a lot about how other teachers, I put that in air quotes, how other teachers saw them. Especially as bilingual students, they said that they got a lot of comments on their writing or verbal comments from teachers about how they really needed to watch it, or, oh, this is not a real sentence. You need to learn how to write a sentence. So what they decided to do when given the choice of what they wanted to make their presentation for the Composition Learning Community Showcase, they wanted to make the argument that they know how to write. So they're arguing here for the prior knowledge that they bring specifically. And I don't know if you can see here, the board that they're standing behind is called Our Beautiful Sentences. And so this came up a lot when we were talking about, oh, other teachers think that I don't know how to write, think I don't know how to write a sentence. In order to provide evidence for their argument that they know how to write, we decided to go through their papers and excavate what they thought were their most beautiful sentences. And so they've identified those and copied and pasted them as evidence towards their argument that I know how to write. So in my third CBS cohort, and I'll try to go through this quickly so Clay has plenty of time, long story short, it was fall of 2016 and Donald Trump was campaigning and then would eventually be elected president. So at the beginning of the semester, when it was just the campaign time, there was some tension that came up in discussions about current events and particularly our political climate, particularly with this cohort of students who have a lot invested in a lot of the rhetorical weapons that have been thrown around from this administration. So in this sense, the students didn't actually need much prompting to find their voice in this situation. Their voice was culturally contextualized and very personal in many cases. So the pedagogical strategy that I needed to employ was listening and being quiet, mainly, particularly because I'm white and I just don't, I needed to shut up and let these students use their voice in our class to analyze the rhetorical situations that they were coming up against on a daily basis. And so in making space for this kind of student participation, especially our class met the morning after the election, that was a quiet day for me, that I just kind of allowed a lot of discussion and a lot of reflective talking to happen. But that was also at the beginning of our research project. So being able to talk through the things that were really emotional, and then also try to contextualize that in an academic, scholarly way, seemed to, if not help, I want to say there was an awareness of their ability to change rhetorical situations to their purposes. And of course, born out of necessity. So while nothing political particularly was on display for this cohort in the showcase, there was a marked awareness. There was a lot of reflective appropriation of a journey that they had gone on as writers, and particularly as rhetors. So in their writing, but also in their ability to articulate why the emotions they were feeling had particular pieces of evidence for their situation. So in all of these classrooms and through the showcase in each one of these instances, there were new kinds of relationships that kept being adjusted, tweaked, and sort of growing out of this. It was my journey, actually, as a teacher. Learning how to reframe the deficit model helped us form a new student-teacher relationship that wasn't authoritarian, but could be more collaborative. Giving them voice, particularly to push against academic or institutional assumptions that they felt were being put on them, helped the student-academe relationship. So students began to see that they could be a part of scholarly conversation. And listening, I think, allowed me to see where my students can connect to the broader cultural landscape in ways that sometimes I can't, but that is important for me to make the space for them to be able to do that on their own. And I would say the composition learning community as a whole has allowed all of these cohorts to develop student-student relationships, especially through the showcase, where they are in conversation with lots of fellow students from other English 1020 courses, and they're seeing this peer-to-peer network that stretches far beyond what sometimes feels like a narrow experience. If you're with the same group and you're in all the same classes together, sometimes it might not feel like you're as much a part of the broader student population as it does when you are in a big room in the student center with hundreds of students who are all in the same course that you are and doing similar projects, but you're talking back and forth. Well, what did you do? Well, what did your teacher make you do? Oh, well, we did this thing. And it begins to foster this sort of broader sense of community in a very tangible and physical way. Thank you.
So my contribution to the talk, I'm going to focus more on myself and on how, no, I don't need that, on how I try to develop relationships with my basic writing students. And I sort of call this contribution Notes Towards a Human Pedagogy in the Basic Writing Classroom. And it's, in the story, it starts a couple of years ago. I went through a intense personal crisis that unexpectedly spilled into the class. And I canceled class one day, and then I thought, I was ready to sort of move on and, planned to go back on Wednesday, but I wasn't ready. And I, found myself as my students sort of asked, why class was canceled, I was supposed to return grades for a project, what was going on, and I found myself crying in all the classes, struggling to deal with the situation going on in my life broadly. And what was interesting though was the way students responded to that. I'd never been in anything close to that in any class that I taught, and students, were saying things like, it's okay, you can cry, and some students waited and would say something as they walked out of the room, and one student in particular, she was homeless at the time, and I knew this because we talked a couple times, and it was hard for her to do the work of the course because of her situation, and she wrote me a note that sort of talked about how her faith in Jesus helped her, and maybe I might think about how that might be a solace for my own self. And it was touching and very deeply personal, and this is what I took away from the whole experience though was it shed away the sort of layers of academic authority, and it opened up in that moment how these are really at root human relationships in our classrooms, and this was a deeply human moment for myself. I was connected to my own tragic experience I was going through, and they were responding as people, young people, and compassionate people. And so this talk is a sort of attempt to think about, why that was possible in the classroom, and I attribute some of it to how I sort of present myself and work with language in the classroom. And language is something that we can't take away from sort of our identity. We can't separate language from emotions and how we dress and act. And one example I think that illustrates that is if you've ever worked in a restaurant or been in a restaurant. I spent many years, and this will come up later in the talk, so many years working in restaurants. When people complain, you might be having a shitty day, and they're really upset about their food, and you might feel like, I hate you, I just want to go home, but you have to respond in a sort of certain way, like, oh, be happy to take care of that, even though you might be thinking, stop bitching or whatever. Like, there's sometimes disconnects, and when you're sort of fulfilling a social role, that's part of it, and it's certainly part of teaching, and you're presenting a social role, you're fulfilling a social function, and you're also at the same time trying to help students learn to develop a certain identity as a student. And for basic writing students, sometimes there's a big gulf between where they're at and where they need to be. They're already smart people. They're here at an excellent institution, but getting all their professors to recognize that intelligence is another thing. And so this talk is a sort of attempt at, part of my attempt at thinking about, what were the things I was doing in my classroom, and how do they open up space for these human relationships. So first I want to talk about a couple scholars that I think helped me understand what I was doing and what I continue to do in a more principled way. And then I'll try and give a couple examples of how I try to unpack some of those things in my teaching. So here's the theory part. So in Teaching to Transgress, Bell Hooks outlines her vision of an engaged progressive pedagogy. For Hooks, it is important that teaching and learning are centered around rich and human relationships between teachers and students. By cultivating our interest in one another and hearing one another's voices and recognizing one another's presence, we can create communities of learning that are marked by excitement and engagement rather than boredom or apathy. Realizing such a dynamic and fulfilling classroom environment requires a collective effort in which both students and teachers transgress the boundaries that have hemmed in traditional education. Practicing an engaged voice in the classroom demands that we connect ourselves to the worlds that exceed the classroom and its academic discourse. For Hooks, an engaged pedagogy is based on a mutual recognition between students and teachers, where each recognizes, appreciates, and acts on behalf of the shared humanity between the bodies that fill the classroom, that occupy its learning activities. According to this view, our work as teachers is not merely to distribute content knowledge, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students, to approach students with the will and desire to respond to our unique beings, even if this situation does not allow the full emergence of a relationship based on mutual recognition. Mutual recognition might not always happen in the classroom, but it always exists as a potential logic for action and interaction. And it's challenging. I always will often say to my students, we're all friends until first grades go back. And, building these relationships is in some ways fraught because we're not really friends, but we can be, but still though, I think the goal is to acknowledge those boundaries and to find ways to build, human relationships despite our institutional connection. So, sort of help myself think more about what it means to transgress these boundaries, as Hooks talks about. What's been really helpful for me is Jean-Louis Gale's work on teaching writing, where she argues that discursive authority is multifaceted and that instructors can best support students' learning of academic discourses, especially when those students come from multilingual or marginalized discourse backgrounds, by actively crossing discourse boundaries with students in the classroom. According to Gale, to simultaneously support students' own discourse or home language practices and to support the writing course's missions to teach academic discourse, teachers must engage in two types of discursive interactions, which she calls primary and secondary interactions. And I'll talk about those in a second. Gale's argument for these two interactions emerged from her analysis of authority in the classroom. She argues that we must acknowledge the dual nature of authority as something that's always indispensable and dangerous. Teachers must recognize how their authority is tied to both their institutional role as well as the expert knowledge they maintain, which is legitimized by the institution. And this authority always contains the possibility to empower and oppress students. Only once this double-edged sword of authority and power is recognized and acknowledged by teachers can we explore new ways to teach. For Gale, dealing with this double-edged sword of authority and power in language entails enacting multiple discourses in the classroom. On the one hand, Gale enacts the formal mode of academic discourse in her writing with students via comments on their work, email communication, etc. And Gale further supports students' work with academic discourse through reading and writing assignments. Gale calls this engagement with academic discourse the primary interaction. While the primary interaction, focusing on knowledge and meaning, how they are formed, perceived, and apprehended through experience, and how they relate to social structures, inevitably involves conflicts of values, beliefs, risks, and pains by bringing students into the context zone of different cultures, different audiences, different discourses, different ideologies, different experiences, different utterances, and thus running the risk of coercion and exclusion, especially for students who don't come from middle-class white families. Secondary interactions, on the other hand, can buttress the conversation for students who use marginalized discourses. For Gale, secondary interactions refer to the range of in-class conversational strategies in which she aims to enact alternative discourses excluded from the dominant academic discourse. This secondary interaction is crucial in a setting like the basic writing course, where, as Gale explains, in short, unlike the systematic, purposeful, and epistemological primary interaction that insists that students come out of their old world and old discourse system by learning the new discourse of university, the secondary interaction, with its understanding of individuals' desires and its respect for humanity, offers a leeway for those students who cannot continue in the primary interaction. As I apply Hooks and Gale's arguments for transgressive pedagogies in my own teaching, I work to open up room for my students' own language practices by enacting my own non-academic discourse. For students from working class and or African American backgrounds, for instance, the language practices they learn at home can be far removed from the language practices in the classroom. As Gale notes, working to develop and practice academic discourse can, at times, exclude those very students from the work of the course. My goal in practicing Gale's primary and secondary language interactions is to acknowledge my students and my own humanity inside and beyond the structures of academic authority. Thus, the primary interaction with students remains closely tied to academic language and genre practices through writing assignments, emails, classroom lectures, and comments on student work. However, at the same time, I engage with students using what I call my primary discourse, which comes from my own working class background and my first career as a line cook and sous chef in the restaurant industry, which, if you've ever seen Gordon Ramsay, you fucking donkey, is not far from how language is used in a kitchen, and it connects strongly for me with the way people talk at home, as I grew up, and So drawing on this set of language practices, I respond to texts we're reading in class. I talk about my own writing process and tell them stories about my experience as a student. These secondary interactions allow me to shed, to the extent that I can, the mantle of academic authority and to be more human. To be a writer who struggles with my current projects, including the draft of this talk. To be a former undergrad student who didn't care about general education courses and was too busy working and getting high to earn a degree the first time I went to college. To be a role model in the sense that I actively use both academic and non-academic discourses to achieve my goals in life. So by sort of pursuing both tracks, I do both by, leading students into academic discourse and talking about how it was a struggle for me and it still is a struggle for me to sort of be both inside and outside. I always feel that way. So to give a couple examples of sort of what this looks like in the classroom, it's very different than the language I use here, and it's not, like for example, the last week, for the first time in my 1010 course, I didn't require students to bring in annotated copies of their articles, and then I was like, well, who printed it out? Because we had conversations early, and they all agreed they prefer to print out text for class, and they prefer to annotate on those printed copies than any other medium. And it looks like a couple of people did. So I'll say, well, what the fuck is that? We had this conversation a month ago, and you all agreed it was helpful, and we did it together for the last month and a half, but why, where is it at? So this very direct sort of mode. Or I'll talk about my own, writing process. And if I were to talk about writing this paper, I would talk about, and I really like talking about my writing process because I really think the things they struggle with don't go away. And, I would talk to them, look, I had this paper to give. And so I spent a whole fucking day dicking around with playing on my iPad, and I couldn't get my shit together until the morning before the talk. And this is a real struggle. And I would have these moments where I know I need to stop doing this and I need to start writing, but I didn't. And so this, in a classroom situation, that would open up to sort of I would invite them to talk about how they deal with the challenge of completing an assignment that they probably don't care about because it's a gen ed course. And that was certainly my experience as a student when I was an undergrad. I always, struggled with the gen ed courses. So I sort of moved back and forth. And I try to do it in principled ways and in strategic moments that I feel like can make myself be more human, something other than the sort of, I sense academic discourse is sort of, it's a very cool affect, and it's sometimes hard to relate to for my students, I think. And so I try to find ways to open up myself and I'll talk about my own failures when I was an undergrad, and I failed 6 classes, and it was ridiculous the things that I did, and they're not different from what my students are doing, and I don't think some of them. And in doing that, my goal is to invite them to recognize that their ways of making sense of their experience can be articulated in whatever language is their own and in the classroom, but at the same time we all work with the academic discourse, and my goal is to help them learn to be successful college writers in ways that they don't disconnect themselves from that language from home, and I think that's important, and I think it's something that I didn't do successfully. And I think about my own experience broadly. I really struggled connecting with my parents, and maybe it's partially because the work I do is so far removed from the world that they're in. And but in any event, I think this is important when we talk about relationship building. We have to find ways to pivot ourselves with students who are at risk, and in order to be a real mentor and to be a coach through learning writing, you have to open yourself up. And one of my approaches, anyway, is practicing multiple discourses, and these are the ones that I have.
All right, we have some time for questions from the audience. And comments?
Yeah.
Can I bring up, I think it's Miss Jenkins,
Yeah.
PowerPoint?
Yeah.
And one of the PowerPoints, it was, it described that, I think it was 65?
63, yeah.
63-year-old man as like a colored man, but it's not really specific.
He described himself that way.
Did he?
He's writing about.
Cause I want to know, like, it sounds
yeah,
so old
he's
timey.
referencing.
I know.
Okay, hold on.
My auntie's 70, so it sounded like she wrote it. I was like,
No,
who
he's
wrote
referencing Langston Hughes' poem.
this?
Thank
Okay.
you. And so let's look at that spot. Hold on. Because they read Theme for English B, and one of their first blog assignments was to just write a response about what it was like. We use it in a lot of different ways. So he's in this little spot. He's I think in that poem, Langston Hughes uses the term colored.
Okay.
I think. And so I think David is drawing from the language of the poem to describe himself.
I was gonna say, was he illiterate or what? He could read and write when he began this program, correct or no?
But you'll see, everything that I put up there, I put exactly as he turned it in. So you'll see
He
that
got
part
better.
of his academic, like he was still working on mastering that academic discourse. A lot of everything of what he turned in was still it took a lot of time on his writing. So the blog posts that I have up here are more like first draft versions of
Yeah,
things.
because at the end, the recap, he talks about now I do all my writing on computers. And dude, I'm like, we only do writing on computers now. But you know, that's the...
Yeah, but he was just fresh back at school after working at GM for a long time. So this was like all brand new.
Yeah.
But if he was in school before, it was a long time ago. So yeah.
Yeah, I relate. My auntie, she's 70 and she goes to Wayne County Community College now. She handwrites everything and I type it for her.
Mhm.
So I just don't have the patience for her to be like... So
Yeah.
it's like you're helping, but you're not helping. Yeah, I should just make her type it, but I don't have the patience.
Yeah, so probably for her too, like half of the experience is just figuring out the technology and the sort of requirements of the class.
Yeah.
And then there's that other layer of all of the learning the teacher stuff that we want people to do, which is
That's all I had to comment on.
Well, I thought you all three of you, certainly I would have benefited from your own individual presentations so I could answer the whole question.
Yeah.
But I think the three of you really captured the challenge of being an instructor in an area where every student, not just the high-risk students, but every student brings something with them that could be an impediment to getting better at writing from a university standpoint. And as you each described a circumstance where you assist them by having the patience with whatever obstacles they bring with them, the patience to allow them to feel that way and even encourage them to express that and use that as a strength to move them to a different level of understanding and communication and expressing themselves. As a gen ed course, we hear all the time from students because, you know, we're all involved with new students. So we have it, well, you know, it's like Groundhog Day, right? We make that journey. We get a little bit better by virtue of having that continued exposure with a variety of new people who all bring something new and unique. And yet I think that it gets no less challenging to us, to perhaps more meaningful as we encounter the new obstacles, but more meaningful to have that patience. And a university doesn't have a lot of patience. A university expects you to arrive as a top-notch, highly rated and highly testing student who's easy to teach in whatever subject. And they get a lot of attention for that. So I really appreciate you all and what you do.
Thanks for saying that. And I think that if I can point to one of Aid's sources, the Camborne piece, I think one of the, correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that is something that's always in the backs of our minds is that students who have confidence that they're doing okay do better.
Mm-hmm.
Which is so, it's like odd to think that like, especially if you're not doing good, like, I can't really write. That what that student needs is confidence that they can write or that at least that they can learn to write. And so that definitely is something that we think about a lot in all these interactions. And because, as you pointed out, we only have 15 weeks with them. So, yeah. Lisa?
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is for you, Nicole. I've been to the composition learning community, and it's sort of my once a semester inspiration moment. The students there are always so excited to share what they've learned, and that is just so powerful. I'm always blown away by how enthusiastic they are, and then also kind of how reflectively articulate they are about what they've learned. So I just have to give kudos to that. My question actually is for you, Clay, and I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more about the relationship aspect to transgressing boundaries and how important it is to make sure that relationship of safety is in place, because I do get, as the associate chair, I get student complaints, and I don't get complaints from your students ever, but I have had complaints from other students saying, I'm very offended that my professor swore in the classroom, and this is not professional, and this is like more than once I've had students not like when their professors break that boundary. So I think you are doing something different though when you...
So you don't get that from Clay students? How's that happen?
Plenty of opportunities. That's an interesting question. It's challenge. There is a challenge in it.
Well, you said you were strategic.
I am strategic,
Yeah,
and I gave two examples. One, I think both reflect, the tenor of the discourse that I try to use. One sort of retains the authority, like, what the fuck, why didn't you print these out? The other one is strips away my authority, because it talks about, I couldn't do this writing assignment that I had. And I also, so in that way, I try to do both of those types of things. I also try to open the curtain at some point, and because I like to talk about language and how it's tied to identity, and I push them to think about why we're in this class, and to think about, and I'll tell them, look, you are all smart people. You wouldn't be in. This is one of the best universities in the world. And this is a research-intensive university. Yes, you're in basic writing, but you're smart people. And the goal here is to help you to get other people to see that through writing. And then, so I'll open up the curtain too, and I'll talk about, look, and I'll point out that at this point, I've already had moments where I've shifted into my primary discourse, and I'll point out those moments and I'll say, look, I'm moving in between these, and I've learned to talk and to use language in the sort of dominant mode, but I can also be smart in this other way, and so maybe that's part of it, and so that's that's a lesson. That's a sort of there's a reading that we do, and in that reading there's an interesting example, because it's James G's work, and he tells this example of this girl sitting with her family talking, and she's telling about what she did that day, and she says something like, well, when I think about it, Gregory's the most offensive character. So we talk about those moves when I think about it. What does that mean? What is she saying to her parents about her identity? Gregory's the most offensive character. And then later she talks to her boyfriend and she says, what did I ask that guy was? So we talk about what that move is. How they both mean the same thing. Gregory's a dick, or Gregory's a jerk, or we don't like Gregory. And there are two different ways of saying it, and one's sort of formal, one's informal, and they express different things. And so I try to make the whole thing part of what we're learning.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
2 points I'd like to contribute. What I think are related to the model, the anti-deficit model. People who work in applied linguistics, which is part of my background, have found great success in what they call the empowerment model. That is, take African American students. They come to school with a lot of creativity, because on the streets you do rapping, you do verbal battles, you do signifying. I mean, the African American male and female grow up in a context where verbal artistry is part of what they know. And they come to school, and that is an empowerment. And language is about creativity and so on. So I think one thing I read about is about verbal shuffle and so on, where people would encourage students to put in rap what they want to say. And of course, then they are empowered in the class because they can teach people who are not from that culture about that. Also, some people teach contrastively. Say, African American kids, especially if you grew up in the inner city, come to school with a deep knowledge of African American vernacular English. So, whether or not you believe it is a systematic variety, which is what hundreds of linguists have written about and published, massive PhD dissertations that are sitting in Harvard and so on. So there's, whether or not you believe that, but you know that there are certain certain ways in which they express themselves. And so you can have, say, this is home language and this is school language. You empower the student who knows home language. You can say something in home language in this way, and then translate it and so on. So empowering the student, and a lot of people, I can think of John Rickford and John Ball and Arita Ball up the street here, have had great success in that kind of model. Their African American students learn to write quite well, and then they feel confident within the classroom. So I think this is, and part of what you say is very valid within that context, because you encourage students to reveal themselves and to present themselves openly in class and take advantage of the warmth of the teacher and the willingness of the teacher to accept them as they are, because the teacher himself or herself is open. So that's sorry to be such a long-winded presentation.
I know we're running over time. My question for Clay, my question is, it seems like you're a caring, emotional person, academica, but it's kind of like that's who you are. Like you're not two personas. Like usually it's the professor in your outside life. Or like for me, like I'm Texas, but at work I'm Sharia. So it's like your personas are clashed together. Do you think you're too close to be connected to the students? Because I don't know. I think I would have to get the emotion out of it, but that wouldn't make it easier to connect to my students. That would make it harder. So I don't know. Seems like you have like a lot of burdens because you know your students and you love them so much. But then when that grade comes, like you say, it changes because you didn't do the work that you were supposed to do.
It's challenging in that there are inescapably moments of judgment as a teacher, and it's your job. And I draw a lot, I think, on my own experience too, as having struggled through college, and I had many moments where I was given graces that I'm not sure I earned from my teachers, and I think those came out of moments of, I'm not sure, maybe they were sympathizing with my struggles or whatever, and I don't know, I tried to do both, like to, I mean certainly sometimes, you didn't do the work and you have to do the work, but sometimes I'll try to make, when I can, I will try to make connections, like I understand there are things going on. When I finished undergrad, I had a full-time job, a 40-hour plus job, and I had a kid, and so, you know, that's part of it. But yeah, I don't, you know, but I do think you were all, one thing I also want to comment on, because you were sort of suggesting maybe these things are close for me, these two sort of identities. And I do think there is some truth in that. But, you know, the way I talk to people, though, like all of us, it's curated. You know, when I see a friend that I used to cook with, it's, man, what the fuck is going on? That's how you, and there's a handshake. And that's part of it. And that's how you identify with each other. And that is not how I greet colleagues here. And and there's not, I have no handshakes with anybody I work with here. But in the kitchen, you know, like that, you know, it's just different. And I, like, they're connected because they're in me, I think, but I can, you know, I can turn them on and off in ways when I need to or want to. And so.
But it makes you a better teacher, so it's
Well, you know, I hope so, and yes, I guess the other part of this is I don't, you know, I use this as a strategy to invite sort of students to open up, and like Walter was saying, like this idea of, you know, I was thinking about to invite them to open up. I feel like I have to open up and show my own fissures, and what, you know, and probably some students it may sort of not invite them to open up. For some of them it does, and I feel like I know you sort of have to gauge each of your students and find a way to connect.
What else?
Just that maybe Walter could join me in having the, asking the provost to come see the showcase.
Yes.
Where you actually get to see the student sort of response and version and engagement of this kind of teaching, which is an extraordinary university moment. And I'd love to see, you know, have more administrators get a sense of what's going on in those first year classrooms. So that's to pick on you, Walter. We can invite them together.
Bring all your friends.
Yeah, exactly.
To piggyback off of that, I know that the provost is hosting the Student Success Summit like a couple days before. It's on November 29th. And the entire group would benefit from you all being there in that vast audience, as there's going to be several interactional activities to share how students attain success and their journeys to success, all of which you've talked about in various ways. But I know that other faculty will benefit from your sharing in that forum. So please come, and please everybody come and bring their friends.
Cool, thanks.
Oh.